Okay, hi. Welcome everybody to a virtual Tennessee Local Food Summit. I think that you're out there. I can't see you, but I think people are here. So this is a new and strange experience for our Food Summit team, but we are really grateful to gather regardless. I just want to say a few things before we get started. Thank you so much to all of our sponsors, all of our local businesses and organizations who have supported us throughout this experience. Thank you to all of our volunteers, especially Nicole Turner, who has been a really huge help throughout this whole process. And I would also like to thank all of our speakers and presenters for taking the time to educate us. So just a couple other notes. At the bottom of the screen, you have a chat box. Please feel free to write your name and where you're from. You can introduce yourself so we can get an idea of who's in the room. And if you have any questions throughout the discussion, please put them in the Q&A box. Last week, we had some questions in the chat box and it was a little confusing. So use the Q&A and we'll get to as many questions at the end of the hour as we can. So with that, I just want to introduce our moderator. Ursula King is a soil and water ecologist, a policy advocate, and writer. She is the owner and principal consultant of Regenerative Community, which concentrates on soil and water ecology, ecological teaching and learning, policy and governmental advocacy and organizing. And she's a great asset to our Middle Tennessee food community. So with that, I'm gonna turn it over to you, Ursula.
Thanks, Natalie. And welcome to all of you watching tonight's food and climate change discussion. I'd like to introduce our panel to start off. Dr. Leah Dundon is an environmental attorney at Beveridge and Diamond and a researcher and the director of the Vanderbilt Climate Change Initiative at Vanderbilt University. Greg Brann spent 40 years at the United States Department of Agriculture, 24 of those years at the Natural Resources Conservation Service, and now consults privately with synergistic grazing management. Zach Wolf is the farm manager at Caney Forks Farm after years of managing programs in regenerative agriculture for beginning farmers and conducting research with several noted organizations. And Michael Baute, did I get that right, Michael? Who works for Silicon Ranch, where he is responsible for developing and implementing the Regenerative Energy Program, bringing over 15 years of diverse land and resource management experience across various ecosystems and land use types to his role at Silicon Ranch. So welcome, panelists. Thank you for joining us tonight. Tonight, our aim is to provide information about the synergy, and many would argue the necessity of agricultural practices that can help mitigate rising world temperatures and the effects that come with that for our planet and for all species. We hope to talk about practical efforts underway, methods of engaging a wider segment of agricultural producers in these efforts. I'd like to start this conversation by giving a simple definition of regenerative agriculture, so we are all on the same page. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2020 stated, regenerative agriculture, quote, takes advantage of the natural tendencies of ecosystems to regenerate when disturbed. In that primary sense, it is distinguished from other types of agriculture that either oppose or ignore the value of those natural tendencies. Natalie is going to put up a slide here. I believe many of the people watching tonight are aware of the capacity of soil to capture carbon. So although the panel may elucidate details of some of the science in this discussion, that's not really our goal tonight. We'd rather use this hour to talk about efforts to build soil carbon capture in agricultural systems. The Rodell Institute's September 2020 white paper, which Natalie will put a link to in the chat box, talks in their executive summary in the following way. Quote, based on peer-reviewed research and the seasoned observations of agronomists working around the world, this white paper confidently declares that global adoption of regenerative practices across both grasslands and arable acreage could sequester more than 100% of current anthropogenic emissions from CO2, and that stable soil carbon can be built quickly enough to result in a rapid drawdown of atmospheric carbon dioxide. We now know enough to have real hope, and with this hope comes the responsibility to journey down a new path, end quote. So with that, I'd like to turn to our panelists, and let's start with you, Greg. I know in your years working for the USDA and in the Natural Resources Conservation Commission, you've encountered a lot of farmers. You've helped a lot of farmers. So this statement that I just read is pretty exciting. I mean, agriculture could really help draw down emissions. So can you tell us, based on your work, what are some of the practices and how do they support this goal in regenerative agriculture, and how are they different from practices that are in industrialized agriculture?
Okay. The regenerative practices that stand out, like with soil health, there's the principles of maintaining cover on the land at all times, and then less disturbance in the land. And with grazing management, you know, it would be a shorter grazing period. You'd rotate off and give it recovery time, that kind of thing. With cropland, it would be more like no-till or cover crops. And then we want living roots all the year and diversity in the plant community. And that provides root exudates and releases carbon, and that diversity has different root structures and all. So that's one thing. And the cover crops is exciting in that it's not just regenerative ag that's getting into it, because in traditional ag, they need it to fight herbicide resistant weeds. So it's exciting that they're coming along and adding that in to combat that, because there's resistance to all modes of action of herbicides. So there's certain cover crops that we can plant that have some allelopathic nature, and that would be like barley, cereal rye, ryegrass, canola, or rape. And there's more to combat weeds. So there's other practices in grazing management. It's just good grazing management, maintaining cover on the land and some height so we can capture sunlight and deeper roots, recovery, less weeds. There's multi-species grazing. There's a lot of tools in the toolbox.
Greg, can you or any of the other panelists talk about what percentage, let's just talk about grazing animals, what percentage of grazing animals, or in the United States, animals that we use for food, are grazed? And in your work, Greg, or does the USDA hold statistics of what type of practices farmers and ranchers are using?
The most common practice is prescribed grazing, and it's more of a system, or it's all forms of management, but there's some key things that rules do, and that's take half, leave half. You don't graze it to the ground, and you maintain carbohydrate reserves and that kind of thing, and then you let it recover before you graze again. So that's prescribed grazing. Then there's no-till cropping, and where you use a crop roller if you didn't use herbicides. And some people that use herbicides use a crop roller as well to reduce weeds and things like that.
And those things you're describing would support more soil carbon capture.
Right, definitely. And as far as percent of people, there's not a lot of folks, there's a growing number of grass finishing. I grass finish animals myself, but most animals are finished at the feedlot for the last 90, 120 days or so. And I can't say how many are grass finished, but it's not near the number that go on grain.
Mhm.
But they are like a cow calf operation would be on grass most of its life.
Mhm. So statistics show that agriculture currently produces about 24% of the world's human-produced greenhouse gases. So eliminating that through soil carbon capture and then mitigating the greenhouse gases produced by the 76% that's contributed by the rest of human activity seems like something that could really mitigate overall risk. Leah, can you give us a perspective based on your work as an attorney and researcher? Is this something that is being discussed and aimed for when people are thinking about risk assessment and climate literacy?
Yeah, thanks, Ursula. It's really great to be here, and I'm really enjoying seeing everybody's names pop up. This is an incredible participation of really interesting people from different backgrounds on this webinar. So as Ursula mentioned, I wear two hats. I am the director of the Vanderbilt Climate Change Initiative, and through that we work with both public and private sector to take on sort of specific climate related projects related to risk and even some technology things, as well as doing a lot of climate education work. And as an attorney at an environmental law firm, we work with a lot of major industries that are really addressing a lot of these issues directly. Companies that rely on very climate sensitive crops in their supply chain. They're trying to understand their climate related risks and what they can do to help their farmers whose crops they depend on, or working to develop companies that are trying to develop technologies to make agricultural products more climate resistant. So I just wanted to sort of share three insights that I think are important when we start talking about some of these areas. One is, like, as Ursula said, agriculture is a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. We know that. But for that reason, it has the opportunities there are really huge. I mean, over 100% technical potential. There's obviously a long way between technical potential and having it actually happen, but being able to reduce emissions, I think, in the agricultural sector is just incredibly promising. I mean, reduce and sequester other people's emissions as well. And we're really just getting started in that regard. And so the second point is that we really need the right incentives in place. Sequestering carbon through agricultural practices is really valuable. It's valuable to the world, and it should be incentivized that way. If farmers and land managers can make more money or produce better crops by managing their land in that way, in a way that sequesters carbon, that's good and it should be rewarded. And I think one of the main problems is that we don't have either a carbon tax in our country, nor do we have any kind of national cap and trade system. And both of those, I think, would go a long way to really incentivize some of the changes that we want to see in the agricultural sector. California has a cap and trade program. A handful of states on the East Coast have one too. So even now you can make money by selling carbon credits on various exchanges, but it can be really complex and not economically viable to do that, or even possible for a lot of different actors in the ag sector. But I did want to mention, because this is fairly recent, a proposed law in California that came out this past summer, and it didn't pass, but it really was the first bill of its kind in the entire world that is addressing exactly what we're talking about tonight. The bill was aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions from working lands and from natural lands. And working lands included agricultural lands, grazing lands, and forest lands. And the idea of the bill was to actively encourage carbon sequestration on those lands. And so it still may come back in January. The bill may be resurrected, but it's truly the first of its kind, and it could serve as a model around the rest of the country or even the world. And as we all know, things that come out of California eventually make it to the rest of the country. So it is worth noting. But the idea was for CARB, the California Air Resources Board, to identify specific climate goals for those working lands, and then identify practices and incentives to help achieve those sequestration goals. So again, the bill did not pass, but I think it's really important to watch. And one of the important premises of this bill that I think it's important to recognize is that California recognized that without agriculture, they will not meet their net zero emissions by 2045 without this type of bill. And so I think that's really important. And lastly, if nothing else, this recent election, I think, has highlighted the division between urban and rural people in America. And agriculture, I think, really has the power to bridge that divide. We are not going to solve the climate problem without rural participation, and there's really great promise there. Just to give one example, Robert Bonney at Duke, he was at the USDA for a long time, about as high up as you can get in the forestry division. And he's written about this idea of a USDA carbon bank, where the USDA could really buy, insure, or provide price guarantees for carbon credits from farmers, ranchers, and forest owners. So it would be a totally incentive-based system, kind of all carrot and no stick. And I think this has particular promise in the agricultural field. In forestry in particular, there's now a really big push to build everything we can from wood products. These are really long-lived products. You can build a house or a building out of wood and store that carbon for a very long time. There's even talk now of an 80-story wood building in Chicago. It's just talk right now. I think the largest wood building is about 20 stories. It's in Europe. But the opportunities for innovations here, I think, are really exciting. So that's my time.
So a lot of what you just talked about is economic incentives, and you talked about them mostly in terms of government intervention. And I was listening to an interesting webinar from the Rockefeller Foundation with people from all over the world about this subject a couple of weeks ago. And one of the things that struck me is that a person that was at the FAO was really talking about he does not see solutions for agriculture without government. Would that be your view? Without government really taking the lead?
Yeah, I mean, I think in small scales and in some areas, you're going to have private governance initiatives that probably would be successful. But in terms of the scale we're talking about, I don't see it happening without at least incentives. Probably you need also regulatory emissions reductions requirements, but also financial incentives that would make people want to do it, even if they're not required to. So I do think that there is an important role for government, and that the climate problem will not be solved without it, even though private conduct can go a really long way towards getting us there.
Mm-hmm. So Michael, your company is trying to combine two ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Can you talk about that and the potential that you're seeing there? And if you want to also kind of cross-reference, if you'd like to, what Leah was saying in terms of incentivization and things like that, anything in your industry that you've seen?
Sure. So I think it may be helpful to give a quick background. So I'm the director of regenerative energy and land management at Silicon Ranch. We are a Nashville-based solar developer, and we're the long-term owners of our solar farms. It's a little unique in the solar industry in that we're going to own those projects for the next 40 years. We produce about 2 gigawatts of solar energy. And let me translate that to acres, as we're all in the agricultural field. So I manage about 30,000 acres in 15 different states on about 135 different solar projects. Essentially, my role is to manage that land such that the solar modules are not shaded out by vegetation. So utility scale solar is land intensive. We typically need a land base that's flat with good solar resources. That's typically a lot of agricultural land. The solar industry has typically viewed that land management strategy and the vegetation as a liability. Typical control methods are mowing and growth inhibitors to keep vegetation from even growing. My background's, I have formal training in soil science and about 10 years in the regenerative ranching realm. And so I came into the solar industry as a land manager, viewing our land and vegetation as a biological asset, not as a liability. And so really what my mandate is to shift our land management strategy, not only of our company, but throughout the entire industry, and help other solar developers do this as well, to a more holistic and regenerative approach. So currently, out of that 30,000 acres we have, in the past 2 years, we've converted about 6,000 acres to a regenerative land management strategy. Specifically, we're using adaptive multi-paddock grazing of sheep for these projects. The PV architecture, the photovoltaic architecture, currently only allows for sheep. Is the only species that I'll really graze with. I sold some goats to you, Greg, a while back via Ann. I apologize if those goats are being a pain for you, but we don't let goats on our solar farms. We are designing systems that allow for cattle grazing, and we really think that is going to help address the growing friction at the local level of agricultural land being converted and the land use shift from agriculture to energy production. So really what I do is I develop dual use solar farms. Agrivoltaics is a term that we throw around. Our brand of agrivoltaics is called Regenerative Energy. And specifically part of that is really monitoring and quantifying, and at times where possible, monetizing those ecosystem services. So we are looking to generate carbon credits, water quality credits, biodiversity credits, and we're working with some of the more innovative and newer carbon protocol registries right now. So you mentioned, the two different ways that we're trying to address the climate issue. So the energy production side, producing energy using photovoltaics, right? This is a carbon emissions reduction play. We're keeping emissions out of the atmosphere from fossil fuel generation. The land management strategy, that's a carbon removal process. And so by combining those two, I really view this as we've created a nature-based solution for our solar industry. So we're land intensive. Typically, it was a fairly conventional land management strategy. We're shifting that over into having these additional ecosystem services. Now, the energy production is making massive impacts in carbon reductions. Our land management strategy, as we all know, is very slow and incremental process in our ability to remove carbon. So, my project, Regenerative Energy, all the other agrivoltaics projects, we're part of a suite of solutions that we need to keep our global temperatures at 1.5 C per the Paris Agreement. As far as like how we're being received in the marketplace with this concept, solar energy in general is, we're growing rapidly as an industry. The National Renewable Energy Lab estimates 3 to 6 million acres will be under solar by 2030. That's a relatively small amount of ag land. However, with that dual use concept, we're actually able to keep that land in agricultural production. Our company specifically, Silicon Ranch, was founded here in Nashville about 10 years ago by the former Democratic Governor Phil Bredesen and his economic development team. And they've grown that from a small startup to now we're one of the top independent power producers in the country. We are the US solar platform for Shell, Royal Dutch Shell. So when we see oil majors getting into clean energy and carbon removal projects, I personally have a lot of hope in that. And with the Regenerative Energy program, again, we're providing this solution to these growing concerns of land use shift. And many of our corporate customers, specifically Facebook on a bunch of our projects in Georgia where we're powering their data centers, they're requiring us to do regenerative energy on those projects. And so, I spoke in Kentucky last week to the Committee on Natural Resources and Energy. They're wanting to know how to keep ag land in ag production while developing solar. Colorado, we're talking to state legislators as well. Here in Tennessee, we're doing a lot of large projects with the TVA. So a lot of interest in this, a lot of people starting to really not question solar energy development, but really want to make sure it's developed responsibly. And so I feel like our concept has been received very well. And I see a lot of growth in this agrivoltaics space.
And a lot of interest from businesses and places that would be able to increase the the percentage of solar that is coming, of renewable energy that is being produced versus fossil fuels. I thought it was interesting that you also mentioned Royal Dutch Shell, because that was a paper. I just read a paper all about how major fossil fuel companies, what their research and what percentage of monies and things they're putting into research for renewables as their long-term strategy, actually, for still being a company down the road. And you're seeing that too. You're seeing interest there.
Oh, most definitely. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we're all seeing billions of dollars being invested in land use and regenerative land management, and nature-based solutions in general, right? Forestry. But now people are starting to see that ag land and soil carbon is a more resilient form of carbon sequestration. It doesn't burn up. In our case, we can't plow it up. We've built a solar farm on top of it. And so, yeah, we're seeing a lot of commitment, and our corporate customers, their trends are shifting. They're evolving from simply buying renewable energy. Now they want to participate in carbon removal projects. So they're looking at participating and catalyzing this and making big investments in the technology to quantify and measure these.
Right. And I wonder if that's perhaps because they are looking at a cap and trade system potentially actually come into being. Like they're trying to get ahead of the place where they will have be an active member in a good way and as part of that market.
Sure. I'm not personally very knowledgeable about cap and trade. However, I will say the corporate social license to operate is very important. A lot of these major companies, they've got a track record that precedes them. And so they're looking to make change themselves, and they realize they're in the world, and they realize the capital they have access to, and it's time to start putting it in play. And I'm seeing major commitments and major purchasing of carbon removal projects. I'm seeing investment in technology and merger and acquisitions in carbon removal projects. And then they are pushing the lobbying front and wanting policy. I'm not going to speak to the policy specifically, but that's kind of the corporate landscape shift that I'm seeing.
Mm-hmm.
Just add a quick point to add to that, which is that it is really a huge shift that the major oil companies in the U.S. have been advocating hard for a carbon tax because they know it's coming, and a carbon tax is much more easy for them to deal with than a cap and trade system. Exxon devoted $1 million, which is nothing for Exxon, but still it's $1 million just to lobby for a carbon tax.
For a carbon tax.
Which is, a shift, I think, if you look back 10, 15 years.
I see. Thank you. So Zach, you've managed crop and animal grazing lands and been involved in teaching beginning farmers regenerative agricultural methods over the years. And did you also, or have you seen an interest from farmers who are farming more industrially? I mean, I want to keep a focus. We are speaking through the Tennessee Local Food Summit. And I think that a lot of local food, well, I guess it depends on how you define it, but a lot of local food is coming from small farms, but also coming from big farms in Tennessee. A lot of food in Tennessee is produced on big farms, and it's not local just because it's produced on big farms. But have you seen a real interest from established farmers who want to change the way they're farming? Or can you talk a little bit about, I know the history of the shift at Caney Fork Farm, but probably some people don't.
Should I start there, Ursula?
Sure.
Yeah, so just to give a little bit of context, our farm, I like to say, is about maybe 5 years old in this iteration of regenerative ag. This farm has been in the Gore family for about 70 years now. And in the last 5+ years, it's basically been converted to what we would call a regenerative agricultural operation. So we farm about 700 acres across 3 different sites. We raise cattle, sheep, pigs in a multi-species rotational grazing pattern. And we grow vegetable crops, and we have about 50 acres of chestnut silvopastures planted throughout the farm. We're also in the process of converting 150 acres of land that's been managed in conventional corn and soybeans to organic. And we have transitional soybeans on that land right now, going into wheat this next year. So we have a lot of different things going on, and we're also conducting a research program on the farm, studying these practices and their effect on soil carbon. So it's kind of the context of what we're doing, and to kind of help answer your question, I think, and I think Greg would probably be a really good person to also participate in this question because of his experience in the region. I feel like I can only answer it in context with my neighbors and my experience with the neighbors here in Middle Tennessee. And what I would say is that people are super curious. They're like regenerative curious or organic curious. And usually the gateway to that curiosity is the premium in the product itself. So I can think of, as an example, some of my neighbors that are growing beef, probably in the model that Greg was referencing, where they're cow-calf operations, and then they basically take their animals and sell them at the sale barn, or they end up at a feedlot, and they're just getting destroyed on the prices of beef, especially through everything that's been happening with COVID. And they look at the way that we're focused with a direct relationship to our customer, and the way we're able to better control the price of the product and know how much we can expect in terms of our profit margin and our input costs. And they're extremely interested in trying to break into that. But that's a whole nother way of managing a cattle farm, as an example.
Well, it's another type of economic incentive, if you will.
Yeah, and it's a different, and it's a totally different model for that farm to build a connection with their customer versus just taking the animals off every Saturday to the sale barn. So I'd say that's one piece of it. The other piece of it in the grain is just the premium on organic grain, which is tremendous. So our neighbors around here that are in that field are looking at the price of just, feed quality organic grain and seeing the price difference and getting very interested in what we're doing. So the interest is there. I think that the next piece is leading by example. And it takes time, and it takes a lot of time to set up a farm that can show how these practices eventually reduce costs and create yield stability, which is something that we haven't talked about, but is an extremely important factor in this whole regenerative game. I'll use an example of what everyone I think is familiar with. In 2018, the flooding in the Midwest that almost wiped out a lot of commodity farmers that were growing corn and soybeans and weren't able to get seed in the ground because the soil was literally flooded or way too wet to get equipment into. When you take a step back and look at the data coming from those farms, the farms that are practicing regenerative agriculture, or a suite of regenerative practices like cover crops, rotation, they're seeing that they're able to get into their fields earlier. Their fields are able to filter that water, and they're basically able to produce crops in really bad years. And that pattern, when you carry it out over a decade or a couple decades, those farms are showing themselves to be more successful and more stable over time. In the conference we just hosted here at the farm virtually, the new standard, we had a farmer from Ohio, Rodney Rulon, who we used as an example, and he talked about his farm. He's farming, I think, close to 8,000 acres. And he said, in a really good year, he's producing a little bit less than his neighbors, but in a really bad year, he's producing a lot more than his neighbors. And those really bad years are getting more and more common. So yeah, the examples are out there, the practices are out there, the price premiums are out there. I think what is missing is farmer adoption. And maybe Greg can speak to this with his years in the USDA, but farmers are sometimes a slow group to make change.
Greg, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. Yeah, adoption is slow. Agriculture is not known for fast adoption in most practices, but it does seem to be excelling now. We have got the interest with all the buying local and more interest in regenerative ag is just, it's really a growing area. The difference in, say, regenerative ag and traditional ag is, one best way I know to describe it is in extractive farming or traditional ag, they want control of nature, and we're in regenerative ag, we're working with nature, and in the whole control, they just kind of want a sterile seed bed where they can apply what's needed when it's needed and deal with it that way. And in regenerative ag, we want the ecological services to kick in, and it is very resilient. And when you see the perpetual nature of regenerative ag, I believe people are really catching on. And in the last, I'd say 5-10 years, we've seen more growth in that area than in the last, say, 30 years. So I'm positive about it. A lot of young people are interested in it, and the whole COVID thing has drawn a lot of attention to knowing where your food comes from and having a little more control of it.
So I went to the Farm Bureau annual meeting last year, and I also went to Pick Tennessee, and Charlie Hatcher, who is Tennessee's agricultural commissioner right now, a veterinarian, and also he has a many generation dairy farm in his family. It was the first time that I had heard a Tennessee agricultural commissioner talk so much about, he didn't use the word regenerative agriculture, but he did talk a lot about using sustainable practices and how, and those kinds of things. And I guess in your role, Greg, I just want to, in your role, you retired, but then you are now working for, synergistic grazing consultancy. And was part of your motivation to do that because there was a demand for it, that people who were grazing animals really had a demand for learning from people like you?
Right. Yeah, there definitely is a big demand, and I have a grant that covers my work in Tennessee on part of it, and then it can be more extensive too. But and I work in other states as well. But yeah, there's definitely a demand and interest, and I have a pasture walk on my farm every year, and this past one was October 16th. We had about 200 people there, and that's gotten to be common. So, and it's just talking about regenerative ag and how to manage. So there's definitely a lot of interest.
And go ahead, Leah.
I just have a question, maybe for all of you, but for Greg or Zach, perhaps. To what extent does the agricultural extension groups out of the UT system sort of promote some of these practices, and are they there for the farmers when people call and say, what do you know about this? Is that a good resource, or is it not filtered into the UT ag extension system yet?
Right. I work close with ag extension, and it's a good start, and maybe I think some of the regenerative people are turned off by the herbicide recommendations and maybe not presenting the alternative way to manage, but they have a lot of good information, and you can use it. It's I don't want to be critical because I use their information all the time, but it is single variable research, reduction science, and in regenerative ag, we're looking at the whole. So, and that's how the adoption, you have to look at the whole because there's so much to it, so many benefits that are not just from a single variable. So you got to look at the whole.
Zach, did you want to jump in there?
Well, I just really love that Greg said that, and this idea of the level of complexity in these systems, and that the science I feel is just only able to capture so much of what's going on. So people are always looking to quantify and understand through quantification, but a lot of it is the lived experience of the farmer, of the place over time. And, one of the things that we're most passionate about here is research, but we're developing a training program for future scientists so they can become involved in regenerative ag as students, so that when they go into whatever it is, UT, and they're applying for grants, they know the right questions to ask and how to ask them and what's important for the farmers. And so I believe that for regenerative ag to scale and for the extension service to change, it means that we need to change the way we train scientists and the way we even think about incorporating science into our work. So it's a huge point, and I'm really grateful that Greg brought it in to our conversation.
Michael, I want to ask you something I was curious about when you were talking. You said you have several thousand acres with sheep on it now. And where are there farmers farming those sheep? How are you managing your herds?
Sure. So I contract out, I give service agreements to regenerative ranchers. So here in Tennessee, there's an outfit out of, actually they're out of Missouri, but they've got a regenerative roadshow, and they manage about 1,300 acres for us. And they set up a residency flock on a solar project in Millington, Tennessee. It's part of a TVA and a Navy project. That rancher is called Cabriejo Ranch. They're a Savory Institute hub. And he's really been with me, I guess, the past 2 years, helping to really define some of the best practices here. And let me say, we learn a whole lot. Like, we fail certain times, and I'll shut a power plant down occasionally with sheep. So, like, we don't have the kinks worked out. We're working them out. And luckily, our company has, we've got a little bit of flexibility in the risk. Down in Georgia, we've partnered with
on the ground research.
We've got a lot of projects in southwestern Georgia, actually in and around Bluffton. And so the White Oak Pastures manages right now about 1,000 acres, and that's going to triple in the next 2 to 3 years. We're looking for ranchers in Colorado, the Pacific Northwest, Connecticut, Kentucky. And so really it's what I do is I try to recruit the local and regional ranchers that are fairly well schooled in, rotational grazing at a minimum, but hopefully a AMP grazing kind of variant of rotational grazing. When I first started I thought we could just go run sheep and we could just ranch a solar farm. And the past 3 years I've been involved in this, these are land management projects. And so they're at times integrated management. We at times need mechanical control behind the sheep, basically a finish mow. But as we get our feet under us, we hope to shift that over to more exclusively using animal impact to manage these lands. And then I'm going to say at the White Oak Pastures, they have about 3,000 or 4,000 sheep on a 700-acre residency farm that we have. And then they raise about 20,000 broiler hens on that project every 2 weeks. And so we are looking at that multi-species rotational grazing within our solar farm. We're also using the animal impact to establish our grasslands. So the solar industry typically planted turf grass. There was a question in here, so I'm gonna answer the Q&A right now about using Kentucky bluegrass or different kind of sod turf grasses. I view the solar industry having the greatest opportunity of grassland restoration that we'll probably see, right? We have these wildly expensive technical projects. We're putting tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars into the solar power plant. And again, housed on a fairly large land base. And so what I'm trying to do is shift the whole perspective industry-wide. These are grassland restoration processes. And so we're looking at cool and warm season perennial grasses. We are trying to optimize that seed mix for that region. And I do recruit those locals for a very specific reason. They know way better than I do what grows in Southwest Georgia or Western Tennessee than I do from my office in Nashville. And so it's trying to get the locals to take, some ownership of our lands. We give them 5-year service contracts. Eventually, there's some efficiencies to be had. We improve the health of that soil. They end up finding efficiencies in livestock production.
So are there any, do any of you know, are there any incentives coming from government or from other places to help this along in terms of converting more lands? I mean, I know a fair bit about grasslands, and they are really becoming endangered in the United States. So, and they're an incredibly important part of ecological services. So, are there programs that are incentivized through the Farm Bill, through anything that help with some of this?
What comes up for me is a lot that's happening at the state level around soil health. So what I've heard people talking about is how looking at the other co-benefits of managing for soil health, water quality would be one of the biggest ones, and erosion prevention. So a lot of states are finding that if they incentivize better farming and better soil practices, then their construction budgets for their roads in their towns go down because they're getting less washout, less sediment. And if you link water quality to that also, then all of a sudden you're getting another co-benefit. So I think that those are two things that come to mind. And then the other thing is just not even thinking of incentives, but just how to level the playing field. So what would happen if you changed crop insurance? What would happen if you changed farm subsidies? And what would happen if you broke up the trusts that basically have a stranglehold on, for example, the meat industry in this country? Right. That alone overnight would completely radicalize the agricultural space. And then if you started to talk about a tax on not just carbon, but what about nitrogen? Because, nitrous oxide is huge greenhouse gas, way more potent than carbon dioxide. And right now, farmers have no incentive to monitor how much nitrogen they're putting on cropland. And because of the way crop insurance is set up, they can basically have a buffer to fail. And so they're putting way too much nitrogen on land that shouldn't be cropped or is too vulnerable. So I think that there's a lot of really basic things our government could do just at the level of safeguarding environmental regulations, clean water, clean air, clean food.
Right. One of my mentors, John Eckert, says, just throw the Farm Bill right away and start all over again. Just get rid of it. It's getting close to 8 o'clock and we do have some questions here. So I'm just gonna throw these questions out to all panelists and feel free. We have a question. I have been moved by the enthusiasm of my collaborators in animal husbandry and specialty crop endeavors. Is there a comprehensive guide in integrated pest management in Tennessee? Does anyone know the answer to that? I don't, but we can try to find that answer, John, and get back to you on that. And this one is from David Wells. It's specifically for you, Greg. To what degree do you think using biodigesters in cattle and farming operations could we power our communities? What have been their shortcomings?
Wow, I'm not a specialist in biodigesters. White oak pastures might have something like that. Do you know, Zach, if they do?
I don't know. I think of those usually like commingling at dairies, being a part of it.
Right.
Dairy operations, yeah.
I don't know of any in the state.
I can speak to it a little bit. Specifically in California, with some of the low carbon fuel incentives that are happening, there's a lot of bio, like methane capture projects happening at dairies. And so I think it is incentive based. I don't see a lot of it outside of California that's moving as fast as the investment in biodigesters there. So good question, David Wells.
Right. And I think in California also, part of that is because there is some regulation around it. There is some state regulation around that for cattle farms. I used to live out there, and driving I-5 from Northern California to Southern California, the cesspools can be 30 miles big. of cattle waste. So there has been some real.
And I'd like to, I guess, another comment. I have my concerns with it, frankly. We're seeing, some of the largest pork producers, maybe in North Carolina, they're really leaning in on that, and they're selling, methane as the new cleanest energy. Meanwhile, there's hundreds of thousands of hogs just in terrible conditions.
Yeah,
and so we're talking about animal welfare and methane production via biodigesters. I think there's a very fine line to walk on that.
Right. Thanks for bringing that up. So let me see, there's another question here. Any thoughts as to why land grant universities haven't caught on to teaching regenerative ag? Is there something it's something I'm continually frustrated about with the lack of it is something I am continually frustrated with the lack of as a university student. So this Emma is a university student. She's asking about land grant universities and the way they're teaching.
There's a new drive within, I know, the University of Tennessee to put more emphasis on regenerative ag, and they've just started that. I know a couple of fellows came to my pasture walk because they were encouraged to investigate regenerative ag.
Yeah.
So there is a movement in that direction. So,
in my experience, it depends on the university, but I mean, just trace the money for the funding for a lot of these schools, and
yeah,
what the buildings are, what corporation the buildings are named after, and
I know at TSU there's the gentleman that I've been in touch with and has spoken at the Tennessee Local Food Summit named Dilip Nadwandi, and his chairman actually, and they are very interested, and they're not only incorporating some regenerative ag and organic ag in their teaching to students, but they are also doing research in the field. They have fields there. So there is something happening there, at least at TSU. That's the only part of the UT system that I'm aware of. Here's another one. Where do I find incentives available to beginning farmers in Tennessee? And I think we could provide some information about that. Actually, I will say I went to the PIC Tennessee conference last year, which is the agricultural conference for Tennessee. And there was a very good session with people from several different agencies and so forth about all the different programs that were available for financial incentives for farmers in Tennessee. And so I could probably dig that up and put it out there.
The beginning farmers have they get more incentive payment, a higher incentive payment than other farmers. And that's if, I don't know the policy that well, but if they haven't filed a Schedule F for over 10 years, then they're considered a beginning farmer. And they're like EQIP is a cost share program that pays for things like watering systems and prescribed grazing and just any of the conservation practices, could be cropping or not whatnot, but check with the local USDA offices, and that'd be Farm Service Agency and NRCS, and see what they have to offer.
Mm-hmm. Here's another one. Is there a model of solar and ranching animals for smaller farmers that are on the scale of 3 to 5 acres? That's from Heather. Michael, do you know anything about that?
Yeah, I'm seeing a couple smaller, like boutique solar developers focusing specifically on that. Check out Jack's Solar Garden. It's in Boulder, Colorado. The guy pulled off I think a 3-acre or a 5-acre solar farm as an independent farmer, and he sells power to the grid. He did that. He bootstrapped that. But there's a couple solar companies out there. I put my email out to another question similar, but if somebody wants to shoot me a question, I'd be happy to advise on that.
I know there are a lot of local solar companies. I actually worked at a organic farm outside of Boston for 9 years, and we put a 10 kilowatt array on an 1815 barn after having to do a little bit of structural engineering on the roof. And, it's dual metered, and we got an enormous amount of incentive. In the state of Massachusetts, there was a lot of money around for that. And we had about 28 acres, about 9 of those acres were in meat production, and another, well, anyway, we don't have to go into all the details, but there are ways to do solar on smaller scales on farms. And Leah?
I just wanted one of the reasons there's money in Massachusetts and the East Coast is because of RGGI. It's the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So
Right.
that there's a lot of money on the East Coast in those states that we just can't get in Tennessee.
Right. Yeah. I think someone asked, how do we get the Farm Bill rewritten? I think a lot of people have been working on that for a long time. It is a serious question. It's a really serious question. I can give you some resources if you want to read about that, but does anyone want to comment on that? I'm not sure. It took a long time to get this one, but not sure a lot of progress.
I want to back up on the programs available now in the current Farm Bill, and that'd be the Conservation Security Program or Stewardship Program. It's been under different names, CSP, and it's incentives for carbon sequestration and just any number of things. So you could look at what all is available within that program. It's kind of like a green payment. It's to incentivize people that are doing a good job already. Whereas EQIP is more a fix-it program to fix lands that have resource concerns and need addressing.
And Greg, if I'm correct, wouldn't the Comet Farm be a model that folks could use to kind of tally up their different conservation practices and spit out a carbon report? And
right. Right. I haven't used that. I've seen that, and it does look like it's a good program to work with. Yeah.
So Ellery has a question here. Zach, you talked about this a little bit. Can you speak more about nutrient loading and ways regenerative ag can solve this huge problem? And I just want to say, in addition to that, you really can never talk about agriculture in my mind without also talking about water. And we could spend a whole nother hour or 3 on that subject. But does anyone want to talk a little bit more about nutrient loading and regenerative ag? Because it is an important part of it.
When you say nutrient loading, do you mean like nutrient cycling around the farm, or avoiding?
Ellery asked the question. She might want to, I'm not sure what she means. She just says nutrient loading. Maybe she means nitrogen, or I'm not exactly sure.
I consider it's over application, and it's in the runoff. Like phosphorus isn't usually a problem. We usually need phosphorus on the land, but if you apply too much animal waste, the phosphorus is so high, then phosphorus moves and contaminates the waters, and then you get this algae bloom, and then you get the oxygen die off and all kill,
I mean, practically speaking, on our farm, all of those pollutants in one system are a tremendous resource in our system. So animal manures, we love them, and we either make compost from them, or we make sure that they get back on the pastures that have anything taken off, specifically like hay ground or crop ground. So, it's the ruminant, the animal has an amazing way of carrying nutrients around the farm. And something magical happens in the rumen, I believe, of a cow specifically. And so that cow has a central part of our fertility program. And again, thinking of this waste product in a lot of farm systems is a key resource in a regenerative ag system. It's just about, how do you balance it all? What's the ratio of animals to cropland, and how do you set up a system so that those animals can be incorporated into the cropland, or that those wastes can be composted and reapplied to the land. And it's not anything new. It's actually, Greg keeps using the word traditional, and I would say that it's the truly traditional form of agriculture, where hay, grain crops, and animals were all part of a long-term rotation.
Right. I'm going to just leave, there's one question here for Leah, and I think we're going to end it there. What effect will managed retreat in the face of climate change have on farming in both the near and more distant future? Leah, you need to unmute.
Sorry, thanks. That's a great question. So managed retreat, there's a lot of words that you can use to describe that phenomenon, but it's essentially this idea that climate change, no matter what we do, no matter how much we adapt, we're going to have to fundamentally change the way we interact with nature in certain parts of the world, whether it means completely moving away from coastlines, or we can think of it as more like transformative adaptation and changing the way that we practice certain practices. And so I think agriculture fits really well into more of the transformative adaptation, thinking about it in terms of changing the way that we use land permanently, so that we are not putting our communities or our farmers at risk. I think, Zach, you gave a great example about the soil management impacting roads. We might think as a managed retreat strategy, let's just move the road, but maybe if we change our farming practices around that area, the soil will be more stable. So it's those kind of thinkings that really, it's more systems thinking in terms of bringing all of these things together and not just thinking about the farm in one place and the road in one place. And then just sort of on a more practical level, I think we are going to see more open space, so that if there are areas right now where we are densely populated that are just being repeatedly inundated with storms and we're rebuilding back the same way, maybe more open space in certain areas is going to make sense permanently. And if that's the case, maybe that open land can be used in creative ways by the agricultural sector in ways that can handle the storms or whatever is happening in that area that requires the built environment to be less.
Well, unfortunately, we've run out of our hour. I feel like we could probably talk for another hour now that the issue of water has been brought up and some other things. But Natalie, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you all so much, the four of you, for being here tonight. I really enjoyed the discussion and learned a lot.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Thanks to all the panelists. Thanks, Ursula. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. I know there's some very exciting, interesting things happening on the news. So thanks for taking time to be here with us. Tune in next week. We're going to have a discussion about food justice in Middle Tennessee. Really important conversations. It'll be 7 o'clock. Next week's actually going to be a 2-hour session. I know that's kind of hard. 7 p.m. now feels like 10 p.m. But it'll be an hour-long panel discussion, and then the second hour will break out into breakout rooms with each of the panelists leading a room. So we'll get to have a little bit more in-depth conversation next week. So thank you all again. Hope to see you next week. Have a good night.
Good night.